Hello everyone and welcome to this video in Mr. Wilb's Science. Today we're looking at the very first topic within the very first unit of the biology GCSE AQA content. So the first unit is all about cell biology and the very first topic is cell structure. This video is appropriate for both the combined science topics as well as the separate science biology. So let's have a first look at what the syllabus actually says that you need to know. So you've got to be able to explain how the main subcellular structures relate to their functions within cells. So if we break that down into the different bits, we've got what the subcellular parts are, what parts make up our cells, why do we have them, why do our cells need these to do their functions, and where can you find them? Because you've got your animal cells and your plant cells and your bacterial cells, and you need to know which ones are in which. So before we get cracking on that, let's have a think first about what actually are cells. So I always like to think of cells as the basic building blocks of living things. They make up me, they make up my cat Rory, they make up my plants in my garden, they even make up bacteria and protists. Viruses are a little bit different, but we'll cover that in a future video. But if you can think of a living thing, they're probably made of cells. Bacteria and protists are single-celled organisms. They're only made up of one cell, so we might call those unicellular. But everything else, plants, animals and fungi, they can be made of more than one cell, so we refer to them as multicellular. So we'll go down then into the first topic, which is all about our animal cells. So this is an animal cell. This is roughly what it looks like with my terrible drawing skills, and we have to be able to identify the different parts and their functions. So first up, we have this big red blob that's in the middle of the cell. Don't mind about the colours, it's just what I've done to make things stand out a bit more. But this large chunk in the middle of the cell, we call that the nucleus. The nucleus is there to store all the genetic material, all the DNA of you inside your cells. It's kind of the control centre of the cell. It controls what happens inside the cell. My top tip here is to never refer to it as the brain of the cell. Big no-no. Okay, you do not get any marks for referring to the nucleus as the brain of the cell, but you do for saying that it controls what happens inside the cell. Okay, moving on. We've got these little dots here. We call these ribosomes. Ribosomes, they're very small. You can't normally see them with a normal microscope, but they're responsible for making proteins, which help our cells to grow. It helps us to grow and get stronger and used for structure and support and all these kind of things, but ribosomes are responsible for making these proteins. Next up, that jelly-like substance that holds everything in the cell, we call that the cytoplasm. Okay, it's normally referred to as jelly-like, but its main function there, it's the site of where lots of chemical reactions happen in the cell. Moving on. These lovely purple shapes here that I've got, we call these mitochondria. I think we've all heard the expression mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. Please never write that down in a test or an exam. Okay, but mitochondria, they're the site of respiration in your cells. We'll cover respiration in a future video, but it's a reaction that happens in the mitochondria that helps to give us our energy. We take some glucose, a type of sugar, we react it with the oxygen that we breathe in, it produces carbon dioxide and water, but it also helps to produce the energy that we need. Okay, and finally, the black line that runs around the drawing of my cell, that is what we call the cell membrane. All that does, it just controls what comes in and out of your cell. So there are 5 main parts to your animal cells. You need to know the names and the functions, which sounds like a lot, but especially when we have to look at plant cells as well. So here's the plant cell. It's a bit more complicated than our normal animal cells, but as you can see, a lot of it is similar. Okay, it's still got the nucleus, cytoplasm, ribosomes, mitochondria and a cell membrane. All of those still do exactly the same function. Okay, but plant cells just have a few extra bits. First things first, this outer layer. Our animal cells don't have that, but plant cells do. And that is called the cell wall. It's there to give plants a bit of protection, but also it's their structure and support mechanism. If you think about plants, they don't have bones like animals do, like we do, so they have to use a cell wall to give them their structure. It's also important to recognise that our cell wall is made of something called cellulose. Next up, we have what we call the permanent vacuole. It's a storage space inside the cell. It can store water and sugars. Normally stores the sugars as something called starch, which is something else we'll look in another video. But your permanent vacuole is there to help with storage. Okay. And finally, we have these little green blobs that are generally actually green in real life as well. We call those our chloroplasts. They're there to absorb light. Plants, most plants anyway, don't tend to physically eat anything, mainly because they don't have a mouth, Venus flytraps excluded. But our chloroplasts are there to help absorb sunlight. Plants do a reaction called photosynthesis, where they use the sun's light to make their own food, normally in the form of a sugar called glucose as well. So chloroplasts are there to absorb the light needed for that photosynthesis reaction. Okay, so one term that you'll come across every now and again is the term eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are types of cells that have membrane-bound organelles, or parts of the cell that have a membrane around them. So things like the nucleus, things like the mitochondria, anything like that that's got a membrane around it will mean that cell is a eukaryotic cell. So examples of eukaryotic cells tend to be your plant cells, your animal cells, and your fungi as well. Another term you'll come across as well is what we call prokaryotic cells. So prokaryotic cells, the exact opposite of eukaryotic cells, no membrane-bound organelles. They've got nothing like a nucleus or mitochondria within those cells, so we call them prokaryotic. They tend to be a lot smaller than eukaryotic cells as well. They tend to be about 1/100th of the size, but it's because they're normally too small to have these membrane-bound organelles. So this tends to be bacteria, which brings us on to what we're going to look at next. We've also got to know the structure of a bacterial cell. And here it is. So, we've still got our cell wall, still does exactly the same function as it does on a plant cell. It's there for structure, support, and protection. We've got our cell membrane, still there to let things in and out. We've got our cytoplasm, still the site of chemical reactions that happen within the bacterial cell. Starting with the new parts though, we have this tail at the back, which we call a flagellum. It's there to help our bacterial cell move around. It's important to recognise though, not all bacterial cells have a flagellum. Some may have more than one, where we'd say they have more than one flagella. There are some species of bacteria that have got up to about 30 flagella. So this is more just looking at what may be there within a bacterial cell. But like I said, it's important to recognise that not all bacterial cells have a flagellum. Okay? What we have instead of a nucleus is we just have the loose DNA that's just floating around in the cytoplasm. As mentioned before, bacterial cells are what we call prokaryotic. They don't have any membrane-bound organelles in the cell, things like a nucleus. Normally because they're far too small to have one. So the DNA that makes up your bacteria, that genetic code, is just floating loose within the actual cytoplasm itself. And finally, we have a plasmid. Okay, so this little ring of DNA is what we call a plasmid. It's quite a funky little thing. It's extra DNA that our bacteria can swap in and out if it ever needs to change its genetic structure. More on that in one of the further units coming up that you'll normally do under the genetics and inheritance module, but for now these are the parts of a bacterial cell that you need to know. So, as always, it's always good to do a practice exam question whenever it comes up to anything to do with your GCSE. So, here's a question. The diagram below shows a single-celled alga which lives in fresh water. We can see the various spots there. What exams like to do is to give you a question about something you may not even recognise, but to use your knowledge around it to answer the question. So we've not covered what an algal cell looks like in this video, but if you look at the diagram, we can recognise the flagellum, we can recognise a vacuole, nucleus, chloroplast, a cell wall. We know what those mean. So it's about using our knowledge of these words to help answer this question. So which part of a cell labelled above? First of all, traps light for photosynthesis. So a good answer to go for this question would be the chloroplast. Okay, it makes you try and think that the light sensitive spot might be used for trapping the light. But if it's just light sensitive, that just means it's going to detect where the light is. It's going to help our algal cell move to where it's going to be nice and bright for that chloroplast to absorb the sunlight. Okay, and which part is made of cellulose? For that one, it's going to be the cell wall. Cell walls in types of plants and bacteria tend to be made of cellulose. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you've enjoyed the video, please don't forget to like and subscribe for any future updates, and I will see you soon.